Welcome to this explainer. We're going to dive right in today because we're unpacking a deeply tragic, frankly mind-bending case that really forces us to question exactly how the justice system defines and proves criminal intent. We'll be breaking down the timeline, the evidence, and two completely opposite legal theories of what went down on one fateful afternoon. Right, so we start with the chilling aftermath of a shooting. Imagine a distraught young husband, Skylar Neitz, sitting in police custody, just repeating this haunting phrase over and over. My wife is dead. Just kill me. Please let me die. He was claiming he had just made the absolute worst mistake of his entire life, a catastrophic accident that killed his young wife, Danielle. And honestly, that brings us to the central mystery we're tackling today. We're going to look at two totally different interpretations of the exact same physical evidence. You have to ask yourself, did a highly trained infantry soldier simply make a catastrophic fatal error while handling his weapon? Or did he commit a calculated, cold-blooded execution? Let's look at who was involved to kind of set the stage here. First, you have Skylar Neitz, a 21-year-old infantry soldier who had literally just walked through the door after a grueling 19-day field training exercise in eastern Washington. Then you have his wife, Danielle. She was 19, and friends always described her as super bubbly and energetic. These two had a total whirlwind romance. They got married at a courthouse just 5 months after meeting, and they were just settling into a new off-base apartment. Okay, the most critical window in this entire case is this incredibly tight 12-minute escalation of events. Think about this. At 5 p.m., Danielle is on a completely normal, happy FaceTime call with her best friend, clearly excited that Skylar is finally home. But just 12 minutes later, at 5:12 p.m., she's fatally shot. By 5:45 p.m., Skylar is already sitting in an interrogation room. So the million-dollar question is, what on earth happened in those 12 minutes? Part 1, the investigation begins. Well, when investigators arrive, the facts of the scene immediately cast a shadow of doubt on Skylar's whole tragic accident story. Instead of trying to save his wife, Skylar didn't even call 911. A neighbor who heard the noise actually had to make the call. Skylar had absolutely zero blood on him, which tells you he didn't check on her or try to render aid. And get this, he actually took the time to empty bottles of alcohol, throw them off a balcony, and stash the AR-15 rifle back in a closet. To detectives, this didn't look like an accident. It looked exactly like a cover-up. And things got significantly worse for Skylar during his 7.5-hour interrogation. You see, he kept changing his story about how he was actually holding the weapon when it went off. First, he claims he hit it on his thigh. But later, as detectives really pressed him, he changes it. Now he says it was up high, maybe on his shoulder or maybe his wrist. For investigators, dealing with a trained soldier who can't keep his weapon-handling story straight, that was a massive red flag. Part 2. Case for murder. Because of all this bizarre behavior at the scene, the prosecution quickly built their theory. To them, this was a clear-cut case of first-degree murder, rooted in a need for absolute control. They brought in text messages to paint Skylar as a deeply jealous, controlling partner. In one specific text, Danielle calls out his insecurities regarding an old high school friend named Jeremy. It really highlighted this underlying, bubbling tension in their short marriage. So the prosecution argued that the trigger for this execution was, incredibly, a seemingly minor dispute over who bought 2 bottles of alcohol. Here's the story they told. Skylar had asked his army buddy, Anthony Foss, to get them booze. Foss forgot. So Danielle asked 2 other men, including an old boyfriend, to buy it instead. The state's star witness claimed that Skylar found out about this the second he got home and just erupted into a blinding jealous rage. Now combine that alleged rage with the physical evidence. The state pointed out that the fatal shot was a direct hit. We're talking dead center to the back of the head from about 5 feet away. For the prosecution, a highly trained soldier, a guy who literally builds his own AR-15s, firing a perfect center mass shot like that could only mean one thing. It was an intentional, premeditated execution. Part 3. Case for manslaughter. Obviously, the state's evidence looked incredibly damning, but the defense came out with a completely different narrative. They painted Skylar as an exhausted kid who just made a lethal error. And in a really rare, frankly stunning move, defense attorney Michael Stewart didn't even ask the jury for total innocence. He openly admitted his client's hands weren't clean. Instead, he asked the jury to find Skylar guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter due to a catastrophic weapon handling error, completely denying any premeditated murder. To back this theory up, the defense actually broke down the exact mechanics of an AR-15 to show how even a trained soldier could make this mistake. It's like a mechanical illusion. If you pull the charging handle back, miss seeing the single bullet left in the chamber, and let the bolt slide automatically forward, you might falsely assume the gun is totally empty. Then, when you pull the trigger just to relieve the tension on the spring, which is a super common practice, boom, the gun fires. But the defense still had to explain away Skylar's bizarre post-shooting behavior, right? The prosecution was arguing his lack of aid and his crying in court were just theatrical and cold-blooded. But the defense argued the exact opposite. They claimed that Skylar's failure to render immediate aid wasn't coldness at all. It was sheer paralyzing trauma. They argued he went into such deep shock that his brain simply broke in that moment, leaving him instantly suicidal the second he realized what his mistake had cost him. Furthermore, they went on the offensive and aggressively attacked the prosecution's motive. They brought in other Army buddies who directly, flat out, contradicted the state's star witness. These guys testified that they didn't even see Anthony Foss on base that day, that there was absolutely no fight over alcohol whatsoever, and that Skylar was incredibly happy and excited to see his wife. They basically aimed to dismantle the entire jealous rage narrative from the ground up.
Part 4. The final verdict.
After a grueling month-long trial, the jury had to reconcile two entirely opposite stories based on the exact same facts. And it all hinged on these legal distinctions. You see, they weren't deciding if Skylar pulled the trigger. He already admitted his actions caused her death. They had to figure out what was going through his mind when he pulled it. Was it the intentional and premeditated taking of a life? Or was it the reckless and negligent taking of a life without that intent? Jury foreman Rolf Flick perfectly encapsulated their struggle. He noted that because they already knew Skylar pulled the trigger, their sole agonizing task was determining his invisible intent. Think about that for a second. Determining invisible intent is arguably one of the hardest things the legal system asks everyday citizens to do. Ultimately, during those tense deliberations, the jury just kept coming back to that number we highlighted earlier, 12. Those 12 critical minutes between the happy FaceTime call and the fatal shooting. Without any audio or additional witnesses in that room, the jury found themselves completely unable to find any concrete proof that a raging murderous fight actually broke out in such a tiny, tiny window of time. Because the prosecution just couldn't definitively prove intent for murder beyond a reasonable doubt, the jury compromised based on the defense's own admission of guilt. They returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. By doing this, they were officially defining his actions as the reckless taking of a life rather than a planned execution. When it finally came down to sentencing, the judge did not hold back. He handed down the absolute maximum sentence allowed under Washington state law for manslaughter, 13.5 years in prison.
At his sentencing hearing, Skylar accepted responsibility for his recklessness. He stood there and stated, "They were my actions and my actions alone. I was reckless and negligent, and for that, I will pay." He maintained to the very, very end that he never intended to hurt Danielle and that the whole thing was just a horrific, completely avoidable accident.
And that leaves us with a pretty haunting reality about the justice system, doesn't it? When the only two witnesses in a room are the shooter and the victim, how can a jury ever truly know what was going on inside a person's head? Sometimes the absolute truth of intent dies with the victim, leaving the rest of us and the justice system to simply weigh the shadows. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this breakdown helped clarify the incredibly complex mechanics of this tragic case.